Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anara Tabashaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Sherray. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any question for our guest. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким поклоном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you, Anna and Katerina. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome back our contributor, Dr. Mark Thomas. He is at Salle University of Philadelphia. And Dr. Thomas has Ph.D. in political science from University of Notre Dame. He also completed MA in international relations and has MBA from American Graduate School of International Management. Before returning to academia, Dr. Thomas worked for many years in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and other countries in Europe and Central Asia. He will be talking on the prospect of the peace between Russia and Ukraine. Dr. Thomas, please, microphone is yours.
All right, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back. I actually thought when we first scheduled this, that this presentation would be overcome by events, that we'd have a peace treaty by now. We're quite not there. So I'm going to start and pull up some slides really quickly, and please stop me throughout. I am not wed to my slides. In fact, I really don't like presentations using slides, but this will be helpful. I've done this presentation at Villanova, and I want to go through it, and we'll go quickly. And the title of the presentation, From Conflict to Concord, How do we establish a lasting peace between Russia and Ukraine? And I guess the part that really we really have to think about is all countries are in some form of conflict. Even if we say we're living peacefully with them, there's always something that we're arguing about. And I used to use Canada and US as one of those examples where we had a good peace, but given the current administration, relations seem kind of tense. But I'm going to go back to a quote which is up on the board now from Karl von Clausewitz, who said, "War is a continuation of politics by other means." On that continuum of total peace, which no two countries are ever at, and total war, we're somewhere on that spectrum. And the question is, how do we get to a lasting peace, which really means the end of armed conflict? So right up front, we have at least what were Putin's demands for peace, which is that Ukraine needs to seek control of Donbass, Zaporozhye, Kherson, the southern part of the Ukrainian peninsula. And as of today, apparently Russia occupies 99% of Luhansk, 7% of Donetsk, and about 75% of Zaporozhye. Now, the numbers could be off by a little bit, and the numbers could be wrong based on who you're getting the numbers from, but these seem to be the most objective. The second one, and these are all and statements, so if you're a lawyer, all of them have to occur for there to be a peace. Ukraine has to abandon its aspirations to become part of NATO. And I'm not even sure if Putin will be happy with Ukraine being part of the European Union. And then kind of along with that, he said, even if Ukraine doesn't join NATO, NATO can't put peacekeepers into Ukraine after the armed conflict ends or to maintain the peace. So I'm pretty sure he'd prefer OSCE, which not armed peacekeepers by any means. And then the third statement is removal of President Zelensky from power. And I think the subtext there is somebody that Putin likes to be put in power. So those were his going in, that's his going in position. I'm only showing you this because this is kind of where we put that spectrum. And this is where Geremesev, and when I talk about the Geremesev doctrine, when Geremesev wrote this doctrine, he was doing as much a look at international politics as a what do we as Russia need to do, and not so much based on what the West had already been doing and how he had seen things develop since the end of the Cold War. So you'll see a broad spectrum here that conflict, as I would say, even in Geremisev's mind, never ends. And there become different tools that you can use after the armed conflict ends, most of which involves influence operations, economics, political means, diplomatic means.
Excuse me, Mark, excuse me, slides not advanced.
Are not advancing?
No.
Okay,
Sorry.
let's do it without.
Yeah, now they are.
Okay, so we're seeing Geremesev doctrine.
You're off now. Please share again and advance.
Let me share again.
But Mark, as you're doing this, I am totally impressed remembering how good you are at explaining things.
Oh, thank you. All right, let me go back to share. Okay. All right, so here's the Geremesev doctrine. And again, it was much descriptive as it was prescriptive what he thought Russia should do. So you have different tools in there, as I was talking, influence operations, economics, political, diplomatic pressure. And what we're seeing right now is influence operations on behalf of both the Russians, the Americans, and the Ukrainians to try to shape the peace. But how do we shape that peace through influence operations? And it could be part of why he's not ready to get a ceasefire yet. We'll go into that a little bit further, but please stop me with questions. So let's go back and think about what are really the root causes, at least. And notice I have causes crossed out and have excuses for what the conflict's all about. The first one has been that Ukraine was historically always part of Russia, and I can even throw in there culturally part of Russia. Let's think about the historical part, which is that it's kind of a bogus argument in the era after World War II or even after the end of the Cold War. And let's think, if I'm not mistaken, part of Ukraine used to be Poland and part of Poland used to be Germany. And if you ask the Czechs, part of Poland used to be Czechoslovakia. Then we go over and we say, well, actually part of Romania used to be Hungary. And you go back and say, well, the Dutch, part of Belgium used to be the Netherlands. If we go far enough back, we can say, well, according to Caesar, part of Europe is now part of Italy. So the idea that historical background should actually provide the justification for war is totally outlandish. We drew borders in 1945. We kind of solidified them in 1991. So the respect for the current borders, or the borders at that point in 1991, are really what we have to think about. The other part is culturally, and this is very debatable. I've actually looked at, the ancient chronicles and how actually the chronicles of Kiev and Rus and the city-states around it, Russia tended to actually co-opt them under Ivan the Terrible. And I'm sure Dr. Shrey's brother, Nikki, will tell us a great deal about that if we had him around. There's also the idea of the persecution of ethnic Russians by the Ukrainians, which is, as far as I can tell, totally unfounded. There's also the idea that there are neo-Nazis running around Ukraine, which are going to, again, this is part of that influence operation to try to turn the West against Ukraine. That totally is also kind of a very bogus type of argument. What we really get down to is Ukraine's leanings towards NATO and European Union, which tends to be more legitimate, only if you take the assumption that that is a real threat to Russia. And I would actually say, yeah, that is a significant concern for Russia. And I'll go into that a little bit again next slide. Now, Russia does have strategic imperatives, which go all the way back to the end of World War II, but one is to control warm water ports. They need them, one of which happens to be Sevastopol, the other Vladivostok, the other one St. Petersburg, and another small thing over in Kaliningrad. The other one's NATO expansion. That NATO expansion is actually, and strategic imperatives, all of these, and even the one about Ukraine's Western leanings, all assume that Ukraine or the West poses a threat to Russia. And I'm old enough to remember, and all of us probably here remember the days right after the end of the Cold War, when relations between Russia and the West were warming very greatly. It's only in 1999, definitely by 2004, then definitively in 2008, where Russia assumes or takes from, actually based on things that the West did, that the West poses a threat, and not as much a physical threat, but an existential threat in terms of anything that resembles democracy and liberal trade is a threat to the powers of people in Russia or to the oligarchs in Russia. And we'll go into why that becomes important. The other part is there are economic opportunities in Ukraine. One is that land bridge from Russia needs a land bridge to Crimea, so it can get to Sevastopol and supply fresh water into Crimea. Crimea's fresh water supply is not large enough to support the population, so it has to come from somewhere. Also, Ukraine is rich in natural raw materials, especially there's some new reserves found off the west coast of Crimea. It's also a major energy transit point between Europe and Russia, and there's this significant amount of transit income that comes from that. And then there's actually the mineral wealth, which has come up very much recently, and that goes to the rare earth materials, which are in Ukraine, which are very valuable and Russia could use. And then there's the production capacity that Ukraine has, and then it's more importantly, its know-how and technologies, which is far advanced of what Russia has. And Russia could very much use that to help their own economy. Or at least if Ukraine would orient towards Russia, it would help them a great deal. Almost all of these, the last four, are all assuming that there's no way of building a peaceful exchange between Russia and Ukraine or Russia and the West. And let's look then at the deeper things at play here, which are the core causes. One is that Russia is non-democratic with a very ambitious leader, a very aggressive leader, and he or they fear the contagion effect. The conference last week in Washington about the future of Ukraine, or the president of Ukraine kind of hinting towards the future, assumed that if Putin were to be kicked out of power, things would be all good. I firmly doubt that the person that replaces Putin will be just as aggressive or ambivalent towards Ukraine or democratic Ukraine as Putin is right now. So it doesn't matter if Putin's in there or anybody else. And some of us remember far enough back Zhirinovsky, who is probably even further to the right than Putin, which is kind of scary. I put him to the right of Genghis Khan. The other core cause, and I'm going to put a finger in the chest of the West for this, is a perception that the West poses a threat and that the West has isolated Russia. And that Ukraine, by joining that Western bloc, is then going to be part of that threat and part of the isolation, putting Russia further into isolation. I put the blame here onto the US and to the West because at the end of the Cold War, Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, everybody thought, hey, we're going to build this new world order, which is going to involve, we're all going to respect the rule of law and respect what the United Nations says, and we'll resolve all our disputes peacefully. We'll open up trade with one another, and we'll trade freely. Now, the fact that marketization in Russia floundered is part of the issue, but not the whole issue. What really comes into play here is the second Gulf War, and we can compare it back to the first Gulf War. In the first Gulf War, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, it was very clear. It was a clear violation of international law. Iraq had taken over a sovereign state. Everybody in the UN, including Russia, said, hey, this is wrong. We're all going to fight together, collective security, to kick Saddam out of almost said Ukraine, out of Kuwait. And George Bush the first was very good at stopping at the Kuwaiti border, did push for regime change. Flash forward to the second Gulf War, where the whole goal of the war was regime change, with the allegation we're trying to save the West from Iraq developing weapons of mass destruction, but the goal was regime change. Think of Putin now in the back of his mind hearing, oh my gosh, they're willing to push for regime change in a country they don't like. And the fact that we didn't have UN approval for that, and John Bolton will try to argue that we did based on the end of the first Gulf War, that we had some UN justification. I'm not a big firm believer in that, but in Putin's mind, the West is willing to go around the UN and violate one of the terms of that new world order, which everybody hoped, or Yeltsin and Gorbachev thought would work. The other part was regime change, and naturally that scares bejesus out of Putin. The other thing that the West did in 1999 was get involved in Kosovo. Now, I'm a veteran of the Balkans, and I understand what looked like, and there are many fingers to be pointed out in Kosovo. It's not just on the Serbs. But Kosovo, unlike Bosnia, was an autonomous region within Serbia. Bosnia-Herzegovina was a republic within the Yugoslav Federation. So when it seceded, it was a problem for Serbia, because Bosnia, unlike the other parts of the Yugoslav Federation, was very mixed. Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro were fairly ethnically solid. Bosnia was a mess in terms of mixing of the ethnic groups. But Bosnia was a separate part of the federation. Chechnya was an autonomous region within Serbia. So when the West intervenes into Serbia, again, we go back to that New World Order. We've just intervened into a sovereign state as the West without UN approval. It took another 2 months after the US started bombing Kosovo to get the approval. At the same time Kosovo is occurring, so is the problems in Chechnya. And Putin says, hey, if they're willing to intervene in Kosovo, they could intervene in Chechnya. And then roll down to the Arab Spring, where we start pushing democracy across the Middle East, getting rid of regimes or influencing regimes to fall. And Putin starts to get scared. So there is perception that the West is a threat and willing to get rid of authoritarian governments or governments that they aren't real in favor of. And we can bring it forward even today with the incident of bombing Iran to try to get rid of its nuclear weapons. Although ultimately Iran having nuclear weapons is a problem, I look at it as a concern that we did it without any justification other than we think it's the right thing to do without going to the UN. And you'll hear lots of justification back and forth. But Putin in his mind is hearing the West is willing for regime change or to intervene if they don't like what's going on in the country against what they accepted as, what we accepted in 1991, 92. So what are the options to get to a lasting peace at this point? And this is the ideal form. I'm going to pull from my Aristotle, where he says, hey, you have the ideal forms of government, but we need to think what's realistic. But I'm going to give you here the ideal forms. So the ideal forms, and many of you may not like some of the options here, is that Russia becomes democratic. We go back to 1999, maybe 1997, or Ukraine becomes non-democratic. Right? Either one will make Russia happy. The second thing that has to occur, this is an and situation. The West has to dispel perceptions of threat and isolation against Russia. That they will no longer isolate Russia, which means we'd have to open up trade and financial relations. That might entail reducing the role of the US dollar as a global reserve currency. One of the bad things that comes out of this war with Ukraine and the isolation of Russia right now is that Russia has increased its trade, oil exchange with China, and it's building up what amounts to an alternative currency between the BRICS, the BRIC countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to displace the US dollar as a global reserve currency. Why does that global reserve currency matter? Well, to impose financial sanctions, to get after the leaders, people that have money, or to slow down trade. Right now, every international exchange ultimately goes through in US dollars, and specifically through the Federal Reserve Bank in New York City. So if they can displace the dollar as global currency, which you'll see a lot in our US right-wing media talking about the threat to the dollar, it could actually improve relations and it will take US away from being the hegemon. And the other part about that would be the US would have to treat Russia as an equal partner and go back to the terms of the New World Order. And again, this is the ideal situation. So for a realist, it would mean ending the threat to the US dollar as a global currency. So I guess this is an either or in this situation. We'd have to support active democratization and marketization and multilateral trade with Russia. And that means, and part of the complaint that many Russians give is the US really wasn't involved or in how do we say, invested in helping marketization in Russia during the 1990s. And in fact, if you go back deep enough into the argument about whether NATO expansion occurred, one of Yeltsin's concerns all the way back in 1997, 1998, although he tacitly agreed to NATO expansion of Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, he said this will create problems amongst the, the hawks within Russia at the time. And I think his direct quote was something along the lines of, we still view NATO as a threat. Some of us still view NATO as a threat. Expansion eastward will be, again, a problem for Yeltsin. He felt very much undermined by that. And then as Russia starts to become less marketized, they also start to get less involved in multilateral trade with the world. Part of that MBA from American Graduate School of International Management was the founder of that was actually an Air Force general. And his famous quote was, countries frequented by trade seldom need troops. Well, I'm a firm believer in that where trade is going on, you don't need to have troops. And it goes partially back to democratic peace theory, but maybe even to market peace theory, that countries that trade together, seldom go to war with each other. And the other part would be the US would have to stop abusing its power as a hegemon. I put the EU also in there, stop wielding its power and kind of treat Russia as an equal. Again, all of this assumes that Russia is willing to do this. Like in any tango, it takes two people to agree. Just because one party wants to stop fighting doesn't mean the other party wants to stop fighting. So again, this is the ideal situation, not necessarily the most realistic. So again, with my little Aristotle, what's the most expedient outcome? The one I would say the most likely. Given the assumption that Russia and Ukraine remain consistent in their relations, in other words, the US remains a hegemon, and Russia remains authoritarian, and wants to create its own type of economic system, bilateral trade instead of multilateral trade. and we, under the assumption that Ukraine gets to retain its sovereignty, more than likely the outcome of the treaty will be Russia's going to retain all of the occupied territories in Ukraine. This is something that the appeasers in the West are very much like, we'll give you the land, it stops killing, it stops the threat to NATO. Ukraine would probably have to renounce its aspirations for NATO and the European Union, although I put that in a question mark. And I only put that in a question mark because I kind of give you the bottom line up front here, is that one of the problems right now is the West is unwilling to accept that the Russia-Ukraine border is really the new Berlin Wall, the new Iron Curtain. So now, there has to be some sort of security guarantee via joint European Union, EU, hopefully co-production of Ukrainian resources, and it's as a carrot to keep Russia from going in. And again, frequent trade between countries often maintains a degree of stability and investment literally by Russian oligarchs that could allow a degree of, hey, why should we invade Ukraine for getting all the benefits of having Ukraine? But the bottom line is we're going to see the armed conflict may end, but hybrid warfare will continue, and it will be everything from economic wranglings and finagling especially with Ukraine about the the energy transit through Ukraine, where Russia tries to punish Ukraine and how they craft the actual contracts for the energy agreements. You could see things where Russia tries to use its investments to try to manipulate who's in power in Ukraine. But ultimately, what we're going to see end up with a security dilemma, where both sides are going to be trying to maneuver to either one side's going to raise its arms levels to protect itself, perceived as a threat by the other. And you're going to see an ongoing, essentially, in simple terms, it's going to amount to a arms race between Russia and Ukraine or NATO and the surrounding countries. And I will be very upfront that Putin brought this upon himself. And that's because I've worked with the Finns and the Swedes. They're always very close allies with us in every place we went, especially in the Balkans. And the Finns and Swedes were always leaning to help be joining NATO, but Putin's invasion of Ukraine pushed them over the edge. The other country which would gladly, or at least their Minister of Defense would gladly join NATO, is Austria. But the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other parts of the Austrian government are dead set against it. Ideally, Austria would become part of that NATO bloc, but for all intents and purposes, they're part of the European Union. So it kind of blends. But Putin pushing Finland into NATO alignment or alliance did himself a great deal of damage. And by the way, I've just heard that Putin or the Russians are building up forces along the Finnish border. But so let's go on to this next slide, which I jumped to before I finished all my thoughts. So what are the real causes of concern to prevent an enduring peace? The biggest one, I kind of hinted at that, is any agreement we make with ceding territory in Ukraine is going to amount to appeasement, which is probably the dirtiest word in foreign relations. I mean, it harkens back to Chamberlain and the Munich Agreement, and that just led to another war. But the real issue at play here is Kaliningrad is isolated from the rest of Russia, kind of like Crimea was distant from territorial Russia. Russia needs a land bridge to Kaliningrad, like it needed a land bridge to Crimea. The only way through there is through the Suwalki Gap, which means parts of Poland, parts of Lithuania will then become the next target for Putin's invasion. That would be a significant problem because at that point you're into a NATO country and we're into the very war that we didn't want. So the firm line that we have to draw here is in Ukraine. Again, I'll go back that we just have to accept that Ukraine is the new West Germany, and parts of Ukraine may remain under Russian control, but that will be essentially the new East Germany. We have the security dilemma which will develop, is across the borders between NATO and Russia, and then ultimately what the Polish Tereshchuk, which is that little eastern buildup on the eastern side of Poland. And then we have that Finnish ascension to NATO, all of which are going to be very antagonizing to Russia. And on a more, not idealistic side, but rule of law side, not abiding by the 1991 borders shows that neither the West nor Russia respect international law. And for that matter, the commitments they made at Budapest back in 1993, 94, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for promises of non-aggression by Russia and by the promise of Russia and US and UK and France to protect Ukrainian sovereignty. And further into the other underlying issue is the accusations of war crimes which exist primarily by Russians onto Ukrainians. But I'm sure Putin and I have Biela Lubova up there in the corner. She's a blonde across the table. She's the one who's kidnapped Ukrainian children. I just love her name. I don't love her, but I do love her name. Is that how do we resolve the war crimes that occurred? Right. That is a significant problem and a complaint. It amounts to, by all definitions or all criteria of what amounts to crime against humanity, if not into the realm of genocide, is the taking of the children from Ukraine to Russify the children. And ultimately, neither side is going to be satisfied with the final agreement which ended the armed conflict. So we're going to see a continuation of the conflict, hopefully not escalating the armed conflict. But if they go for Kaliningrad, create that land bridge, we're ultimately going to see NATO has to take a stand at that point. At which point, who knows how it's going to escalate. We've made war more fightable since the first Gulf War, and we've exercised that in Iraq, second Iraq, and now Russia's got away with it so far in Ukraine. The Ukraine-Russia war has done a great deal showing that interstate war is possible without escalating to nuclear war. I'm not convinced that invasion of Lithuania and parts of Poland would lead to the West has to call the bluff and get involved, at which point, given our technological advantage and Putin's threat, it would take a lot to de-escalate that from escalating into a nuclear war. Conclusion, the armed conflict will cease, but the conflict will continue in information space, really meaning hybrid or information warfare, and in the political realm below the level of armed conflict. And no matter how this ends, in terms of armed conflict, there will be no enduring peace unless leaders renounce aggression and then somehow dispel the perception of threat that exists between Russia and the West. With that, I'm going to leave it open for questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas. I don't see any hands right now, but I'm sure our audience will have questions. It was a comprehensive review. Dr. Deutsch, please start the question.
Hi. Ideally, a referendum would provide a mechanism by which the people could express their self-determination in terms of political identity, are there any circumstances under which you would see the UN setting up and supervising a plebiscite or referendum or whatever you want to call it that would allow the people affected in those areas to indicate how they want their political alignment to go?
I think the General Assembly could get away with that, but the Security Council, where ultimately the decision rests, there sits China and there sits Russia, which would probably veto. China could abstain, but Russia would ultimately view it as a veto because in Russia's mind, those are two separate republics. The Luhansk Republic and the Donetsk Republic are already independent states. So one of the things I didn't bring up, and it could be that the UN Security Council agrees, and China would go along with this. US and France, UK would have a trouble, is recognizing those two republics as independent nations, which would go against everything in Ukraine's interest and really hurt Zelensky's credibility. So I don't see the UN as a way of a plebiscite of being the solution. They did a plebiscite in Crimea right after the invasion. And even by Russian accounts, the plebiscite showed they didn't want to join Russia. So again, Crimea is a tough situation, primarily because Sevastopol's there and Russia needs that warm water port. So I wasn't surprised when the little green men showed up in Sevastopol and Crimea. So does that answer your question, sir?
I'm afraid so. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, we just have to realize that this is now where we were in 1981, 82. Hopefully we can keep it from getting worse.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. More questions, please, Katerina, comments?
I have 3 questions, and they're completely not related. And the first one I'm almost embarrassed to ask but I'm out of my expertise here. You talked about how appeasement typically led to another war, certainly in the case of the historical examples you cited. So why on earth would why would we be okay with giving up Luhansk and Donetsk? Why would that, what's to say? I mean, it's almost like everybody almost knows that, fine, if there's peace for 5-6 years, and then again, there's going to be another effort to take more land, right? I mean, that seems pretty obvious or pretty well accepted, or maybe it's not. Any thoughts on comments on that?
I could say some mean things about the current administration, but even past administrations, politicians tend to be very short-sighted and think, hey, it happened once, it won't happen again. So if we appease this guy, we appeased Hitler, it led to a war, but Hitler was different than Putin. Yeah. So the line of thought being, Putin will stop here. He's not Hitler. This is a different situation. We've got nuclear weapons. He wouldn't dare do it now. I'm not so sure that the West has any credibility that he won't continue. I mean, we have so undermined the credibility of our deterrence that I'm surprised that China hasn't taken Taiwan yet. We didn't take a firm stand. We didn't back up the Budapest Agreement. What's to say that we're not going to cower? And Putin knows that we're afraid. We're afraid and you heard it when he berated Zelensky in the Oval Office. We're on the verge of nuclear war. You're risking nuclear war. That Zelensky wasn't risking nuclear war. By not standing up to Putin, we risk nuclear war. You have to it's like Cuban Missile Crisis. You had to call his bluff.
Lock yourself in the bathroom.
So
lock yourself in the bathroom.
No, so thank you for that. And I see there's a comment in the, hold on a second here, let me do some technical stuff. Here we go. I see the comments from our frequent, longtime faithful listener, Leslie Titus, put a quote in saying, once you pay the Danegeld, you never get rid of the Dane. That's a reference, I guess, to the period of the Anglo-Saxons. Yeah, so it's a good comment, Leslie. So along those lines, you mentioned that Russia needed a land bridge to Crimea to connect to Crimea, seeing Crimea was already their territory. That's a huge assumption too, right? I don't know that Ukrainians ever kind of gave up on the idea that Crimea wasn't part of Ukraine.
Absolutely, Katya, absolutely. But in Russia's mind, they need a supply route to Sevastopol.
Yeah.
So they have to have that land bridge. Otherwise, they'd have to rely on Ukraine to get to Crimea, and that they wouldn't tolerate. Otherwise, they'd have to use sea routes and that to supply Sevastopol and Crimea. And then I'm going to point a small finger, maybe a big finger, and that in the people of Crimea, I told you they needed fresh water. The fresh water supply in Crimea is very limited. During the period before this invasion, Zelensky was holding back fresh water until all of the Minsk Accords were agreed upon. So they weren't getting enough fresh water into Crimea. So there was part of that. Again, very straightforward. Had they gotten more fresh water from Ukraine, it could have limited some of the popular support, but Russia getting that land bridge now makes it very simple.
Thank you. And then, like, my final question is you opened our conversation by saying that I know we were lucky to book you well in advance, and that you thought by now there would be some sort of peace agreement. And I'm wondering if you could unpack that a little bit, like why you thought that. And you've already shared with us what it could have looked like, but I'm wondering what prompted you to think, was it hope, or what was it? What suggested to you that there's a chance that we might just be done with this?
I thought back in March, April that there was enough coming out of both Putin, the White House, and Zelensky that were going to meet up and start talking, that this would kind of have at least a ceasefire in place. There is not even a ceasefire in place, let alone a treaty. And I'm not sure why. My guess at why Putin wants this, because his signaling is, I want more, and you're not even coming to the table yet to give me partially what I want. I want my demands met. I'll keep fighting until I get my demands met. I think that's kind of the messaging he's trying to put off, because whatever's occurring at the diplomatic table isn't to his satisfaction. So if you aren't willing to meet my terms, I'm going to keep fighting.
Thank you. I see that Anara's got her hand up, so I'm going to yield the microphone to her. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for the presentation. The war actually demonstrated very weak parliamentarian traditions in Russia. All previous democratic reforms were initiated by communist leaders rather than other leaders. And that's actually, I have two traditional questions for Russia question. Who is to blame and what is to be done? And the second actually question is, not question, is just my comment that AI predicts that the war may expand into the Baltic state quite soon. So what do you think about this? Thank you.
Could you repeat that last question?
Oh, that AI, artificial intelligence, predicts that the war may extend into the Baltic region. That will be the next actually stage of this war. And what do you think about this? Thank you.
Well, how dare I contradict artificial intelligence? But the odds are good. That's where that linking up to the Kaliningrad is at. That's they have to go through the Baltics, Lithuania. I don't think they're so much worried about Estonia, because Estonia is close relation to Finland. But I think Latvia and Lithuania are very much at risk. That's, again, it goes back to Kaliningrad. It's isolated. So I know, as far as I know, the ethnic Russian issue in Lithuania, Latvia's a little more tense, but the ethnic Russians in Latvia really like being part of Latvia, not part of Russia. And there's very few Russian ethnic minorities in Lithuania, so that's not even an issue in Lithuania. the real issue goes back, we'll be asking, what does Russia want from it? And I could be giving the same presentation, just changing Ukraine to Lithuania, to Latvia or Lithuania. It's all going to go back to economics and land bridges. So, and your first question, I think you're on mute.
And your microphone is muted.
I'm sorry, the traditional question, who is to blame and what is to be done? At least that's a recommendation. If you know very well Russia, this is a typical questions.
Who is to blame and what is to be done? It sounds like a text out of some Russian philosopher. Actually, it sounds like Lenin, actually. What is to be done? Is it not Lenin? Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. And before that, there were 19th century questions.
Who is to blame? Well, I would all right. Did the West invest enough in Russian marketization? And I think Jeffrey Sachs wanted to do what was he called it, shock therapy in Russia. Shock therapy was manageable in Poland because the Poles strongly wanted to be closer to the West. They wanted the goods out of the West. They wanted the benefits of being part of the West. I don't think the political will existed in Russia to handle shock therapy. And the Russian economy wasn't like the Polish economy. So would shock therapy have worked in Russia? Probably not, because the political will wasn't there. The other part was shock therapy in Poland took a lot of Western investment. We didn't have enough funding to fund the marketization in Russia. We just could not pour enough in to get the market working, get the economic level of economy up. Ultimately, people vote from their stomachs. You saw that during the last US election. People vote from their stomachs. They worry about inflation. They worry about goods on the shelf. Russians were looking at who's going to provide us stability, who's going to fix the economy. And I thought the only way we can do that is put somebody in there like a strongman. It sounds a lot like what we did in 2024 election. Put somebody up there who's going to fix it. So who can fix it? Democracy doesn't fix stuff fast. So I put part of the blame on the Russians for not having the will to do it. Part of it because democracy is not efficient government. If you want efficient government, you look at authoritarians and they make quick decisions. It may not be everybody's interest, but they are very, very quick and very efficient. Democracies are not efficient. It would take a long time, a lot of will. So I'd say Russian peoples are at fault for not having the will and the will to fight back. I always say the bravest men in Russia are the 3 women in Pussy Riot. So, I mean, they're the ones who stood up and fought. And then a few other ones, I mean, the group Leningrad, I'm a big fan of the group Leningrad. His commentary on Russian culture and Russian politics is very subtle, but it's there. But, and the average Russian, they're decent people, but they want to live. So could the West have done things differently? Well, I think yes. I go back to NATO expansion, but even that we were friendly with Russia. It was perception of their threat. You can create the threat. It goes back to why does ethnic conflict exist? Must Serbs and Bosniaks be at war? Well, there's a tension there. There's a history of antagonism between both sides, but it takes a leader to ignite the fire. So Putin, to get power, the easiest way, Argentina did in the Falklands, is let's turn attention away from our internal problems. It will ignite the fire of hatred against somebody else. And it unites us all against a common enemy. And that's kind of what Putin did. Is like, NATO's a big enemy. If we solve the problem with NATO, our life will be better in Russia. So NATO kind of did it, and the U.S. definitely did it again with the second Gulf War and how we did Kosovo and then the Arab Spring. So everybody's at fault here. Right. So what is to be done? Pray. And hope that the human spirit, the desire for freedom, and say, hey, we want a better life, and the existential threat that is the West to Russia, people become discontent with the standard of living, and the fact they don't have total free expression. But that, in many ways, I'm guess in a cynical mood. I've sat around a few places since I've come back from overseas, bars, and watched people. I have a very low opinion of human nature. Is that if you give people enough food, place to live, and the ability to go out to a bar and drink and watch sports, you put any government in charge and they wouldn't care. So
there will be no color revolution in Russia.
as long as he keeps feeding them and letting them watch sports and drink, life is good for the Russians.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Anara. Please, more questions. I might add here that just like Anara and a few others here, I grew up in what used to be Soviet Union and left just 37 years ago before its demise. It's very hard for me and for my generation imagine now completely non-ideological society where the only social lift for men is to be paid for be killed. Do you have any comment on the mercenary nature of current Russian war? It's not something we have had in the Soviet Union or even Nazi Germany. It's not ideology. Stalin forced people to fight. Putin pays people to fight and to die. So what does it, you just represented over an hour a very deep political scientific analysis, kind of still treating human nature as, traditional, starting from Aristotle. I'm not a political scientist, but over the last 3 years, I found that analogies do not work anymore. The world has changed profoundly, even in the United States, even in New York City, not even talking about Moscow. So something calls for revised analysis, I guess, other than relying on old statements. You almost treat Kaliningrad as Danzig of 1938. Does it really work anymore? This kind of science.
All right, let's go. We'll come back to your
Yes.
first question. Let's go to Kaliningrad as Danzig. In many ways, that's very probably right. That's a really good analogy, Victor. I like that one because it holds true. That Danzig was isolated from Germany. It was a free city. Now, you know what? Who asked me the question about the plebiscite? But if we were to do a plebiscite Kaliningrad, a free plebiscite Kaliningrad, I'd be willing to bet they'd vote to leave Russia and become part of Lithuania or become an independent city-state. Because prior to the outbreak of the war, there was this a free trade zone between Kaliningrad and Gdansk, ironically, Danzig, and they could travel freely all the way from Kaliningrad all the way over to Gdansk. Used to drive us in my old office crazy because there's nothing to prevent them from leaving that trade zone. It was a free travel zone. I really think that Kaliningrad is that important because it's a port and it's isolated. But I think the people of Kaliningrad, given a unfettered plebiscite, would rather not be part of it. But that leave out the military folks that are going to vote in there and their families. They'd probably vote in favor of staying with Russia. And again, this takes us to human nature. Why would they vote for that? It's because their pensions rely on it. I knew a family from Donetsk, grew up in Donetsk. They moved from Donetsk to Vladivostok, and they refused because they didn't want to give up their Russian pension or their Soviet pension. Same way, if you promise people their pension, you put their pension at risk, they'll gladly stay with whoever's paying the pension. Now that goes to human nature. Technology has changed, our times have changed, but I'm not so sure human nature has changed since Plato. We actually had a really fun conversation here at LaSalle between a biologist, a psychologist, a philosopher, myself, about what is human nature. Are we self-interested by human nature, or are we empathetic by human nature? So the fact that we kind of assume everybody is self-interested, we go back to Rousseau, were we socialized to being self-interested, or are we born self-interested? And, you know, the biologist is like, well, we're kind of socialized. There's a part of us that is socialized, but there's a part of us which within our brain is actually very self-interested. One of my students brought up a really good question. I posed it during our IR theory class. And I asked her, I said, go back before there was society. Well, she went further back. She said, let's go back when a baby is conceived in the womb. Is it self-interested? And because it's only taking from the mother. Well, is the mother self-interested because she's conceiving a child because she wants to create a legacy. Well, the student came up with a broad idea of benevolent self-interest. Now, are human beings benevolent, or are human beings inherently benevolently self-interested? In other words, we'll act on our own for our own sake to a point, and then we'll start thinking about others. So if we think about what motivates Russians to be mercenary, or for that, we talk about the North Koreans there. If you go back into the Soviet period, you may remember, I'm not sure if you saw it in where you were at in the Soviet Union, but I saw it in Czechoslovakia, I saw it in Poland, where the people that manned the Skoda factory in Mlada Boleslav, Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia, were Cubans. It was a trade excess labor that's sent to Czechoslovakia to help. North Korean, that's a way for Russia to exchange oil for manpower. North Korea doesn't have any good hard currency, so Kim is just want to say, hey, I'll trade you people for oil. It's very mercenary. Now, are Russians willing to fight just for the money? I go back to the experiences in the Balkans. If you look at why people joined ISIL or ISIS, whatever you call it, I all call it ISIL because I want to give them the benefit of the Islamic State. Those people that went into ISIS were going for the money. The promise that they had bad economic lives wherever they were living in Europe. And part of ISIS's promise was, if you join us, we'll give you part of the booty that we get from taking parts of Syria, parts of Iraq. You get to keep the booty. Now, what ISIS ended up doing is kind of skimming off the top and giving people what's left over. It was very economic transaction between the ISIS leadership and the people that joined ISIS out of Europe. I think human nature goes back to, if I can't find a job, I will get money from whoever's willing to pay me. And we used to joke around in Afghanistan. If we want peace in Afghanistan, we'll give everybody $100,000 and a brand new TV. We'll have them loving the West in a heartbeat. Now, that didn't work out too well either. But so Russians fighting for money it's just a natural thing. Until we educate them, until we get Aristotle over there to educate them. There's something above that.
Well, I only can reminisce that the most famous student of Aristotle didn't live that long to conquer the
Oh, yeah, that's right. Alexander.
The world entirely. August, please. You have a question. Please open your microphone.
Okay.
Yes.
Very good talk. I appreciate your emphasis on the Russian fear of the West. Okay. I wonder if you think there's any role from the eastward looking Russians, the sort of modern day Prince Mirskys. Is there any chance that that tendency of Russian political thought would have any sway?
Oh, a fear of China moving east, moving westward.
Yeah.
You know, you must be very Europeanized because there's an old, it's a joke I heard many years ago, and it involved Putin, and you can substitute the president, substitute President Trump, are in a plane together, and the plane crashes, and both Putin and Trump go into a coma. And they're out for 5 years each. They put in the same hotel room. They wake up at the same time. They're given a news. Putin gets a newspaper and he starts to laugh. And Trump says, "What are you laughing at?" And Putin says, "Well, according to the newspaper, the U.S. is now communist." And Trump grabs the newspaper. He looks at it and he starts to laugh. And Putin goes, "Why are you laughing? The U.S. is now communist." And Trump replies, "Well, according to the newspaper, Finland and China just resolved their border dispute." If Russia were considering, and
That is
again,
funny. That is funny. That is funny.
yeah, see, only somebody who's familiar with Chinese pressure on Russia and European politics really understands the inherent fear that China is looking westward, and China. It's amazing, and we're all old enough. Everybody here on the show is old enough to remember there were border disputes between Russia and China all the way back in the 70s and 80s. In fact, the most fighting that occurred during that time period between countries was between Russia and China over the borders out in the east. Russia has to be very careful of China. Right now, Russia is doing what Nixon did and playing the China card against us. Now, China is very smart because they played they played the U.S. card against Russia or the Soviet Union. Who's to say that Chinese won't switch over and play the U.S. card against Russia again? China's New Silk Road, if I were the Russians, I would be very nervous because that's cutting right through what used to be part of their territories. And it will start pulling trade, and where trade goes, so go the heart. And Russia should start considering what China's really up to. And Putin's assuming Xi will always be his friend. But when Xi dies, who knows? I mean, China may say, "Hey, there's a bigger market in Europe and the US. We'll turn away." Now, Russia does give that oil to China, or that energy to China, which China desperately needs. So authoritarian leaders are very finicky or fickle. So, we talked about how part of Ukraine used to be Poland. You can't forget that part of Russia used to be Japan. Actually, I think part of Russia was Japan, or there's the border disputes about Kamchatka and Sakhalin. When I was over in Korea, I met plenty of Sakhalin Koreans who had been taken by the Japanese to Sakhalin to work as slave labor. They stayed there. They were coming back to South Korea to make money. So the world's much more complex than we want to paint it. Yeah. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas. We are out of time, and we need to stop here. But if somebody has a couple of words to say, please do. I thank you for your expertise, and let's say, political realism, should I call it?
This is all very much, hopefully I'm right, I'm wrong about everything. I really hope, I
Well,
really hope.
we have enough political surrealism these days along to take along. Katerina?
Дорогі
Please.
браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
Слава Україні.
Героям слава!